these three topics is a rather complex matter, as we can all understand and appreciate. We can talk about the relationship between agriculture and nutrition easily. We can also talk about the relationship between nutrition and gender issues quite easily. But speaking about all three of them together and at the intersection of all three is not a very easy task. And Professor Nitya Rao is in the thick of all these things, and it's an opportunity for us to learn from her. And my understanding of the matter, I thought I will place before you, and also try to flag some questions which I have in mind and which we may request Professor Nitya Rao to answer from a practitioner's point of view. The first thing, as we all know, the problem with the women in the rural areas is that a lot of them are obviously involved in agriculture because agriculture is the main occupation in the rural areas. So because of that, the large number of women, about 47% or so, are involved in agriculture in the rural areas. And unfortunately, there is the divide in the wages which the women in agriculture earn and the men in agriculture earn, as is the case with several other occupations. This has come to stay, and productivity of the women may not necessarily be low, but there's a difference in the wages. And if this difference is bridged, perhaps the women will do better, more income in their hands. But one question that springs up to mind is this: that look, what can be done to really enforce that there are equal wages to the men and women? Are we able to do this well in other segments of an informal occupations in the informal sector of the economy, be it in the construction worker sector, be it in other sectors, which are in a way semi-organized compared to agriculture? If we are not able to do this in other segments, can we reasonably do this in the agricultural arena is one question that speaks up to mind. The second aspect is that look, the intersection of agriculture and nutritional aspects, to say that look, how are agricultural operations or the women's involvement in agricultural operations affecting their nutritional status? A commonsensical thinking which ought to be there, which ought to have been, we have been thinking, but now being brought out as huge publications, is this: if women are involved in agriculture, so are they involved in the household works. They have to do both. One cannot say that just because you are in agriculture, you're not going to do the household work. So is the case with all other working women. We are working at the same time, most working women in the country and maybe across the globe take care of their families also. This poses additional burden on the women taking care of their family. And more so is the difficulty with agricultural operations is because it's hard, laborious work. When a person does such hard labor and returns home, especially during the agricultural seasonal operations, sowing operations, and harvesting, and so on, where intensive work is involved, after that, do they even have the energy to cook a proper nutritious meal for themselves? This is again commonsensical, as I was mentioning, but now being brought out as big papers, etc. Obviously, for any person who's involved in such kind of intense activity, having drained out energy, they will not be able to give the time and energy which their family deserves. So also they will not be able to give enough time to cooking a proper meal for themselves and for their family. So not only that, the women doesn't get a proper meal, nutritious meal during that period, her children and maybe the husbands also do not get a sufficiently nutritious meal during that period. And that may definitely be lowering the nutritional status of women. This apart, the very hard labor work of the women requires a huge amount of energy expenditure. That energy expenditure compensation may not be taking place, leading to undernutrition and malnutrition and such like things. So, what are our interventions to deal with these aspects is a key thing. Can we reduce the burden of women involved in agricultural operations by bringing in more mechanized agriculture? It's taking place whether we want it or not because of the rise in wages. all over the country, mechanized agriculture is taking place through various various means. Many companies are coming forward and setting up custom hiring centers, and all these things are happening. But custom hiring centers may not be in the reach of everyone in the agriculture area. Small farmers may not be able to afford the charges of custom hiring centers. So, is there an opportunity to bring in small implements to remove drudgery from the work of farmers, especially the women farmers? Is something that we need to be thinking about and understanding, to say that will this lead to improvement in the nutritional status of the women, because the energy drain will be reduced, time spent and effort spent on the agricultural operations can be reduced. This is something that needs to be looked into and taken forward in a more systematic manner, which is easier to address, to say that okay, at least they get the time and have the energy to cook a good meal for themselves and for their family. Other issue that comes up is that is it enough just to involve the women in this? Because when you talk about gender, as many people say, we are only talking about the women. But unless the entire family is there, including the head of the family, or so to say, the male members of the family, and unless they are involved and they take decisions together on crop diversity, on diversifying the agriculture production, only then those who are there on sustenance farming, they will be able to reap the harvest of a diversified crops and diversified nutrition pattern. Diversified nutrition pattern doesn't have to be confined only to a diversification of the crops towards more nutritious crops, such as millets, such as, let us say, groundnut, and so forth, but also diversification of more income yielding avenues of work, such as animal husbandry, which is allied closely to agriculture, and the return over investment in animal husbandry has now far exceeded that of agriculture. So, can we encourage these women farmers to take to more of animal husbandry and such like activities, so that they get more protein into their diet through milk products, etc., in addition to the traditional cropping pattern that they've been having. Another issue that comes up is the pricing system in the country, which is that the farmers, be it the women farmers or the male farmers, they grow nutrient-rich crops, biofortified crops, so to say. Let's say they grow millets, which are rich in iron, which may be rich in zinc, rich in crops which are rich in vitamin A, rice rich in vitamin A, and so on. But there is no price incentive for these biofortified crops, be they be grown by the women farmers or by the male farmers. So, can we create and put in place a system for incentivizing the nutrient-rich crops? Is something that needs to be looked into. Another simple thing to do, obviously, is to say how do we educate the women farmers in particular about the value of these nutrient-rich crops such as millets, groundnut, and so on, and bringing in them an understanding that leads to better health consequences, better health results for the women as well as for their family at the same cost. Just the diversification of the cropping pattern leads to healthier soils, healthier uh, produce, and healthier bodies. So, can we put together systematic programs and initiatives to bring in awareness among especially the impoverished women farmers that diversification of the cropping pattern, of the nutrition pattern, leads to better results? Is something again that we need to think about. Also, as Nitya will tell you, that empowerment of women in the family, their ability to take decisions, substantially decides and improves that what women get in the cake which is available to the family, the produce which is available to the family. So, if the women are empowered to take their own decisions, they would perhaps take better decisions for the children and for the family as a whole. So, empowerment needs to go hand in hand with the with this aspect of nutrition and uh, nutrition, gender issues, and agriculture. So, a step in this direction is again bringing about a linkage between the self-help groups and the gender issues. Self-help groups in the country are a huge movement now with 8 crore women being involved in self-help groups. They are most important thing that they do is empowerment in addition to providing for their own credit requirements at a reasonable interest rate. So, can we utilize this movement to bring about this empowerment, enable women to take their decisions, especially better nutrition related decisions? So, these are some of the thoughts which were crossing my mind, and I thought I will share them, flag them for discussion, and maybe we'll request Nitya to focus on these things and learn from her on some of these aspects. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thank you so much for formally setting the program and setting the tone of discussion as well. Before we move on to the main presentation today, let me introduce the speaker to the attendees here. Professor Nitya Rao is a professor of Gender and Development, School of International Development at the University of East Anglia, UK. She's a researcher, teacher, trainer, and a social activist who are driven by commitment to gender equality and women's empowerment within broader issues of resource rights, social equity, and rural development. Gender analysis underpins all her research, be it in relation to understanding changes in land and agrarian relations, migration, livelihoods, food and nutrition security, growth and well being, equity issues in education policies, and provisioning or indeed process of policy change. Professor Nitya has published widely in multiple areas of gender, such as on the struggle over gendered identities, entitled Good Women Do Not Inherit Land, Politics of Land and Gender in India, Assets, Agency and Legitimacy Towards a Relational Understanding of Gender Equality Policy and Practice, among many others. She is coordinating an UNRISD research project on understanding gender egalitarian policy change in Asia, which sought to understand processes of claims making in relation to the labor rights of women workers, in particular migrant domestic workers, and issues of violence against women. At present, she is engaged with two major research consortia and is responsible for mainstreaming a gender perspective in them. The first one is LANSA, that is Leveraging Agriculture for Nutrition in South Asia, which seeks to identify potential agriculture or food based solutions to the nutritional problems in South Asia. The second is ASSR, or Adaptation at Scale in Semi-Arid Regions, a consortium under CARIA, Collaborative Adaptation Research Initiative in Africa and Asia, which seeks to understand the barriers and enablers of effective adaptation within dynamic and socially differentiated semi-arid regions. In 2016, with partners in Norway and Sri Lanka, Cambodia, India, Professor Rao conducted a cross-country project entitled Migration and Collectives as Pathways Out of Poverty, Gendered Vulnerabilities and Capabilities of Fishing Communities in Asia. She led the India component of the study. Professor Rao is a member of the Global Advisory Committee of the UN Girls Education Initiative, and she has been invited as an expert for gender, land, and livelihoods to several high level meetings. Alongside research and advocacy, she is involved in building partnerships and networks with research and teaching organizations globally, and also building the capacities of researchers and practitioners on conducting gendered research. This includes deepening their theoretical insights to research design, data collection, analysis, and writing. We are very thankful and enthused to have Professor Rao here. We have been trying to get her for our earlier programs as well. We tried to get her for Nutrition Advisory Board earlier, of course, it didn't take off as we planned. But we are happy to have her today, and we hope that today's webinar will be the starting point of many more discussions to have, and we will be able to set up some concrete work together in the future as well. Welcome, Professor Rao, and the presentation is over to you. I will share the PPT now, as I know that you are having some problem at your end. Please give me the cue when to change the slides, and I'll change it accordingly.
Thank you, Ruchira, for that very kind introduction. Thank you, Dr. Narendra Kumar, for setting the agenda. I think these were also the key issues which you have raised. I think hopefully is some of the key issues that I will try and discuss in the presentation and then following discussion. I think it's a great privilege to be part of this webinar series organized by NIRDPR on intersecting identities and development goals. And as already noted, I'll be speaking about really the agriculture, nutrition, and gender linkages. So I would like to focus in terms of development goals on SDG 5, gender equality, but also in the context of SDG 2 on reducing hunger and food security. Just to say that some of the presentation I will also be later on drawing from my work with the high-level panel of experts to the Committee on Global Food Security, of which I've been a member since 2019. So today's talk, I'll divide into three parts. First, I'll give some context about gender, the situation of gender equality, and how it's reflected in the data that we have on food security and nutrition. Then follow this up with some insights from the field. And I think you had mentioned, Dr. Narendra Kumar, about practitioners. Actually, before I took on an academic career, I was also a practitioner for many years in India. I started working with SEVA, which is Trade Union of Women Workers in Ahmedabad and Madhya Pradesh, and organized women BD workers in Madhya Pradesh, and later on worked with women farmers and particularly with tribal women, ST women in Jharkhand. And I think that is where I followed up with my PhD research, and my book is also based on my work in Jharkhand, with which I have kept in touch actually over the last 25 years. Of course, it was Bihar when I started work at that time. So, and the third part is really about thinking about some of the conceptual advances and how can we think more creatively in terms of policy and practice based on what we know from the field and also what we know conceptually. So next slide, please. Could you change, Ruchira?
Yes, I'm just trying. Yeah.
So I think over the last 20, 25 years, actually 1995 was the fourth International Women's World Conference in Beijing, which was seen as a sort of landmark in terms of setting the agenda for gender equality and women's rights. Of course, there had been, since 1975 was International Women's Year, first announced by the UN, and then other conferences, but Beijing was really seen as a landmark. And 25 years have passed. And of course, in this 25 years, one of the key things that has happened is that people have started talking about gender equality. So there is global awareness. There has been a lot of progressive change in favor of women's rights. I think India hasn't done badly, actually. I have just listed a few of the things, especially in the last 10, 15 years. From 2005 onwards, we have the right to education. Before that, of course, was the Panchayati Raj, and NIRD is, I think that was one of the first in terms of women's empowerment before Beijing even, that India had the reservation quotas for women in Panchayati Raj. 2005 was also the right to inherit property, including agricultural land. It was the Domestic Violence Act, also was in 2005. Later in 2013, we have the right to food. And this is interesting, the NFSA, because in this, of course, the main rights holder was the woman, the senior woman in the household. Plus, of course, after Nirbhaya case, we have the amendment to the Criminal Procedure Code, the prevention of sexual harassment against women, and so on. Despite all this progress that has taken place, I think a lot of it has taken place also because of awareness on all sides, awareness amongst the bureaucracy, and also a lot of social mobilization, awareness amongst women's movements, mobilizing, demanding that these entitlements, these claims, that can help create an environment for equality should be pushed through. Of course, there have been problems. I think we know that in certain areas, particularly like violence, despite very strong legislation, we still find the degree of violence going on. And of course, in India, other types of factors, sometimes you had mentioned, Dr. Narendra Kumar, about the equal wages. I think in any kind of neoliberal market driven context, I think the market finds ways to increase its profitability, and often at the cost of the labor. So I think there are these push forces which are pushing back on the gender equality agenda, which includes the whole sort of globalization issue. It includes also things like rising conservatism, rising conservative politics across the globe, which pushes back on women's equal rights. So apart from these broader macro trends, we do have several issues that remain still. Next slide, please. So one of the key things in India has been the sex ratio problem, or the son preference problem. And this diagram is taken from the Economic Survey of India 2018, actually. It was a very interesting diagram that kind of reflected, and this is from the text of the government itself, from the Economic Survey, that not just are child sex ratios which is a key indicator of women's status, that girls are not wanted, becoming more adverse to girls. But what this report, the economic survey, noted was that we have shifted in India from son preference to son meta preference. And what does this mean? So this is, they have got two indicators really. You have the sex ratio at birth, which was the normal indicator that was taken. And if we look at that horizontal line, the sex ratio at birth, you have some states of India, which are Kerala, Assam, mostly the northeastern states, Meghalaya, which are having a positive sex ratio. Most of the other states are above that line, so they have a negative sex ratio. And the further up you go, Delhi, Haryana, Punjab, these are the worst states in terms of this. But the other indicator which they introduced for son meta preference was the sex ratio of the last child. So initially, if parents have an equal attitude towards girls and boys, what happens towards the last child? And this is the vertical axis. And you see here that the situation is much worse, except for Meghalaya. All other states of India are on the right of the vertical line. That means by the time it comes to the second or the third child, I think parents are very particular that if they have only daughters, first child they may not mind whether it's a daughter or a son, but after that they definitely want a son. And therefore the attempt to make sure that the last child is a son becomes stronger and stronger. So this is a trend that has still persisted. It has not gone away with all the development that we have had. Next, please. So given that context, just some of the other things that I wanted to present to you, which I will talk about in this talk really in terms of the other challenges. And I think Dr. Narendra Kumar, you have set these out. One is that the devaluation and invisibility of women's work. And here I'll talk about both the agricultural work as well as the domestic or care work or reproductive work, the unequal access to assets. And this poor health and nutrition, I think, has been very much in the news more recently. It is not only the South Asian enigma, but I think it is an Indian enigma that despite growth, despite India becoming a middle income country, the latest global gender gap report, which was released, ranked India 140 out of 156 countries in the world. It has declined by 28 points. But apart from that, it is in the bottom 5 on health and survival. And this is really a shameful thing for a country like India, which has very good health facilities. We are the health tourism place for people from the global north, for very advanced medical facilities. It is in the bottom 5 on health and survival. And when we look at all these reports, the Global Hunger Index, India is ranked 101 out of 116. So this poor health and nutrition, despite growth, despite everything else, despite education, despite industrialization, is something that we cannot really, it is an enigma. And this is something which is really pulling India down in terms of its global rankings. But this latest global gender gap report, it's also disturbing in another way, that apart from the health and survival, it is showing over the period of time, last 10 to 15 years, that actually labor force participation rate of women has gone down. This may perhaps be related to the point you made about discrimination in wages, that despite a lot of Equal Wages Act, if women are anyway going to be paid less, then maybe they prefer to actually stay at home and look after their children well rather than going to work. But of course, this has consequences in terms of control over income, empowerment, and so on. There is also a decline in India in the women's share of earned income, and surprisingly and interestingly, also engagement with politics. I think even at the parliament level, though we have Panchayati Raj, which has been doing very well, but when we look at legislatures and parliament, actually the women's participation, women's reservation bill has not yet gone through, and also women's participation has actually in this latest parliament declined compared to the previous so, and of course, violence, as I said, despite having acts and despite having protective legislation, we find that incidents of rape, incidents of gang rapes in the public. So these are not just from a sexual point of view, but it is really a power relation. Gang rapes are nothing but exercising of male power over women. These are increasing. These have not declined. So this is, I think, a general challenges that we see, and I will try and unpack some of these as we go along. I think in terms of violence, we have also seen in the last 2 years with COVID, that WHO has put out statistics as well, that globally, with work at home and things like that, with loss of jobs, with decline in earnings, violence against women has gone up. So no law seems to be a deterrent to persistence of violence against women. Next. So very quickly, to give you some statistics on this is just a comparative table with rest of South Asia. And if you see that actually India is lagging behind even other South Asian neighbors, uh, with most of these, with undernutrition and with anemia. Afghanistan might have changed in the last 6 months because they are now facing a very severe food insecurity. But these are figures from a few years ago, when even a country like Afghanistan was doing much better. Bangladesh, of course, we know has been doing much better. Even Nepal, all these countries which are poorer than India are actually doing much better than India in terms of their health status. Next, please. Now, here I want to just say something about intersecting identities. This was part of the title of the talk. That often when we look at, when we say something like, okay, women in India are doing worse than women in Bangladesh, actually, this hides, it covers up a lot of the granular detail and the diversity of India. And I think this is very important to take note of. So, for instance, the southern states in general, this is a figure of a map from based on Government of India data from by IFPRI on stunting, that is height for age of under 5 years. And if you look at the map, the red, of course, is the worst, where it is very high. So we know that the global reports have said, and including our NFHS latest report says that, all India stunting is about between 32, 33 percent of all children under 5 are stunted. But if you look at the red parts, that is actually over 50%. And if you look at the green parts, they are doing less than 10 to 15, less than 20%. So there is a lot of variation even within India. We see some of the districts of UP, for instance, Balrampur, Shravasti, Bahraich, they all have rates over 60%. This is one aspect that in India, given the diversity, we need to have regional or state level or even district level granularity in terms of understanding some of these some of these disadvantages if we want to make change or make some effective interventions. The second example that I would like to take is that also even within a locality, there are certain social groups that do much worse than others. So my own experience has been mostly with working with scheduled tribe populations in Bihar, Jharkhand, Odisha, Maharashtra, Tamil Nadu, and so on. And we find that the wasting rates, that is the weight for age, within tribal populations is much more than within other groups. So even within a locality, even within a district, general castes or other backward castes may be doing slightly better than scheduled caste or scheduled tribe populations. So this is a second element. The third thing which I really want to focus on in today's talk is this puzzle that most of these households actually are rural and belong to farming families. So they're all cultivators. And I think this is where the link between agriculture, nutrition, and gender comes in. That these are all farmer households, these are all producing households. Why is it that these problems of undernutrition, anemia are so severe within these households? So they are producing. Why are they not consuming what they are producing? Or what is it that they are producing? Is it not the right things that they are producing? I think it takes back to some of these questions about what are the crops, who's deciding, how much is sold, how much is kept for consumption, and so on. So I think this is really the puzzle when we look at India in a more granular way. Next, please. And I think this is also a figure from the Government of India Ministry of Program Implementation WFP report of 2019 on food and nutrition security, that what they called as the minimum, and this was also repeated by the Comprehensive National Nutrition Survey, CNNS, which was put out by the Ministry of Health and family welfare, I think very similar results, that when we look at the young child 0 to 2, what they call as minimum acceptable diet, only about between 5 to 10% of children actually have a minimum acceptable diet. The CNNS put this figure as something like 6%, and this report says 5 to 10%. So when we look, and this is part of the, I think, understanding that what is happening within that 0 to 2 age group, or what they call as the first 1,000 days. And I think this is where gender comes in, because a child of that age, 0 to 2, is obviously needs the mother. It is not able to feed itself. It is not independent. And I think this is where the relationship between the disadvantages that the mother faces, the constraint that the mother faces, and also, of course, the contributions of the father, I think, as Dr. Narendra Kumar pointed to, become very important to understand why is children under 2 actually less than 10% having a minimum acceptable diet. And apart from this, another interesting statistic from this report is that for the poorest 30% in India, consumption of all food types for everybody, men, women, children, is below what NIN has called, National Institute of Nutrition Hyderabad, the recommended dietary allowance, RDA. So you have below RDA for the poorest 30%, almost all household members. And an interesting thing here that I found from some of the NIN data when I was looking at my own work with scheduled tribes is that actually on many of these indicators, men tend to do worse in terms of dietary diversity than women in tribal populations. Over the last 20, 30 years, the situation has worsened. And this is, I think, linked to male migration, that at least in these tribal areas where there is some natural resources, some forests, some common property resources, there is some greens, mushrooms, bamboo shoots, forest products, fruits that are available if the women have time to collect them. But these are not really sustainable from a livelihood, from paying health expenditures, education expenditures. So as we know, we saw in COVID also, a lot of these men migrate to other areas, mainly in southern India, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, Maharashtra, Gujarat, to work. And there, their conditions are even worse. They have just a carbohydrate based diet with absolutely no affordability for fruits, vegetables, meats, egg, fish, and so on. And therefore, the National Institute of Nutrition reported that between mid 1980s to 2010, after that, the data is not there, it stops. But actually, the dietary diversity for tribal men of central India, this whole central Indian belt, Odisha, uh, Andhra, Madhya Pradesh, Chhattisgarh, Gujarat, Maharashtra, it actually worsened over the last 20 years. So actually, men are also not doing that well from these particular social groups that we are talking about. Next, please. So I think, what does this kind of context, in terms of the differentiation by social groups, differentiation by location, what does this tell us about meeting the development goals? And I think I'll try and answer some of these questions in terms of how these experiences are gendered. They're differentiated also by social identity. So within gender analysis now, we very strongly argue that we should not just look at it even as men and women, but we should look at which type of men and which type of women are we talking about. So amongst women, for instance, somebody like us who are in this webinar, who belong to the middle classes, we are educated, we have enough food to eat, are very different from maybe some of the scheduled caste, scheduled tribe women in remote rural locations. So even between women, there is difference. By age, there is difference. By location, there is difference, and so on. So women in Tamil Nadu, even rural women in Tamil Nadu, I did one study comparison with UP, are much better off than rural women in UP, for instance. So I think we have to be very aware of these differences of social identity and location. And then finally, I think we will try and look at some of the mechanisms. I think given that you are at NIRDPR, for addressing some of these differences, and how do we adopt or move towards much more integrated and systemic approaches. Next, please. So I'll try first to give, based on a lot of research literature, I think there has been some effort now to look at these interconnections. And I think, as Dr. Narendra Kumar pointed out, that a lot of the effort tries to link two of these phenomena, either agriculture and nutrition or nutrition and gender, how do we link the three of them together? So I think, just to give some background, I think a lot of the literature around agriculture and nutrition, it basically sees that the number one point pathway is that agriculture produces food. So if you are a farming household, you are cultivating, you are producing food. You can either consume it or you can sell it and get an income out of it. And this way, it can contribute to nutrition either directly through food or through the income it generates. Of course, we know that this is not working, this link, because there is an issue of seasonality, very important. I think in a lot of tribal areas that I have studied, but also other areas, they always say that the monsoon period or the peak agricultural season is the hungry period. This is because by then they have finished off the stocks, whatever they may have had from the previous harvest. They have a lot of hard work and not enough food to eat. So this is really, seasonality is an issue. Of course, everybody doesn't have land, so landlessness is an issue. And also, we will talk a little bit about the whole issue of diversification of both crops, but also of livelihoods. And very importantly, a lot of people have given up on agriculture because of the prices, not assured prices, pricing mechanisms, and so on. And that is why in most of these households now, men have started migrating for other kinds of work, and women are left with the farming. Also, what type of farming? I'll give you some examples. That there is a shift, I think, which you were hinting at, Dr. Narendra Kumar, from food crops towards cash crops, often in tribal areas to plantation crops, because these kind of on contract farming, because these may save on the labor with men absent from these areas. But the kind of income that these bring in, which is a lump sum income perhaps, it contributes to other expenses rather than food expenses. The second kind of pathway, I think this I will not discuss that much, but I think I just wanted to put this on the table. The second kind of pathway is really the trade or market related pathway about expenditures and incomes. And I think this is where what are the pricing systems, how are price mechanisms working, are certain crops incentivized or not incentivized? I think we saw it in the recent farmers' struggle, that why with Punjab especially and the government giving a lot of incentives and basmati rice being such a big export crop responsible for export earnings, why farmers don't want to shift. So I think these pricing mechanisms are very much linked to the cropping mechanisms. But there is also an issue around expenditure and how, which kind of expenditure is prioritized. And we saw this also during COVID and so on, that first of all incomes went down, purchasing power went down, but also people had to prioritize health expenditures. And I have read so many reports in the newspaper that even from Hyderabad and other places, that rickshaw pullers, poorer urban dwellers who got COVID had to go to the hospital, pay very high levels for oxygen, for treatment, and therefore their consumption of food was completely cut down. Whatever assets or money they had was disposed of to pay for health expenditures. Similarly, I have found people even in Telangana, the ICRISAT studies, village studies show over the last 30, 40 years, in Tamil Nadu, in Pondicherry, where I have researched, that even as household incomes increase, families prefer to spend on educating their children so that they can move out of farming. So huge money is spent for private education or for health expenditures, and the food consumption doesn't improve. So in fact, I was doing some work in Pondicherry, and I was happened to be there in March 8th for International Women's Day, and the local organization, they decided to organize a blood donation camp. A lot of the women came very enthusiastically to participate in the blood donation camp. None of them could actually give blood because all of them were anemic. And this is despite improvement in incomes over the last 20 years. So I think there is also a gap between income improvement and expenditures on a healthy diet. The third pathway is where there is less work, and which is where I will want to focus on today, is what they call as understanding women's work, or putting women's work at the center of agriculture nutrition links. And there are three kind of sub pathways which I will talk about. And I think in his framing, Dr. Kumar also referred to some of this. One is that if women are working, so if they are earning wages, let us say, or incomes, do they have control over the incomes and decision making? So therefore, can they purchase food items that are beneficial to household nutrition. And I saw this again in many parts. In Dharwad, when I was doing some work in northern Karnataka, the women said when they were being given some awareness on nutrition, they very blank, straight away they told us that no, you're giving us all this nutrition information, but actually the marketing or the shopping is done by our husbands. So we don't have any control over what they will buy in the market. So please educate our husbands into what to buy. So if you're telling us eat millets or eat something else, vegetables, then please tell our husbands, because we know all this, but we have no control over the earnings. So that's one. The second part is the time and the time dimension. That especially, as I said, if you remember the map on the 0 to 2, which is a very critical phase for nutrition, that women, when they are involved so much in agricultural work or in other work, then they don't have enough time for, especially for cooking and feeding. And I will give you some more data on this, and this leads to negative outcomes on child nutrition. And the third is, of course, women's own health. This is an issue about drudgery, energy expenditure, and so on, and maternal undernutrition. So let's go to the and I think in tribal areas, when I was saying, when we look at relatively high women's work participation, this may be one reason explaining the relatively low, high levels of child undernutrition in these tribal areas as well. So again, if we look at the figures on agricultural participation in South Asia, very high. Majority of women are engaged in agriculture, including in India. It's more than 50%, actually. 56% is the figure. This is World Bank data. It will, of course, have regional variations and state level variations and so on. Amongst tribal areas, it may be 80%. In other areas, it may be less. And so what is happening here? That if women are so much involved in agriculture, why are some of these benefits? We really need to unpack some of these linkages. So the three pathways that I spoke about in terms of incomes, the first pathway is that often women are not working for wages, but they're working on their own farms or family farms. So the men are migrating, or even if the men are there, it is a joint. In India, farming is a joint activity. Whichever crop you take paddy, particularly the paddy less than wheat. Paddy is very much a women's crop in a way. They do the transplanting, they do the weeding, they contribute to the harvesting, and so on, mainly working at home for a majority. I think scheduled castes or the landless are the ones who are going more for paid work. The rest are mostly as unpaid workers. So when they don't receive an income, this first effect in terms of do they have a choice in terms of what food to purchase if they need to purchase, this question becomes unclear. The second thing, rightly, I think, is that a lot of the work that women do, transplanting, weeding, it has a lot of drudgery with potential negative effects on women's own health. I think small mechanization is clearly an option. And I think there is also, we find a lot of regional variation on this. So in the southern states, for instance, Kerala, Tamil Nadu, you have small weeders and so on. So we do have the technology which have been adopted. But again, in the northern states, in the eastern states, we don't find these being adopted much. It could be a landscape issue also. Like in tribal areas, which are undulating, slopey, it may be difficult to use some of these equipment. And the third, of course, is the additional burden of domestic or care work and very little support with that. Next, please. So I think before going into some of the data on this, I just wish to, just reiterate this point that in all the discussion or the examples or insights that I give, it is very important to look at, what is driving women's work, its time and intensity of women's work. It is about seasonality. So all year round is not the same pace. This heightens during the planting, during the harvesting. At other times, there is less work. So it is really dependent on the cropping pattern and seasonality, the household socioeconomic status, the ethnicity, caste, location. This is very important. What is the composition of the household? So is there an older person to look after the children? Is it a nuclear household? What is the age of the child? These are very important. I think the prevailing labor market arrangements is very important. Also, apart from that, is the healthcare, prices, economy. these become important. Male contributions. So what are the men doing? Like in this picture, are the men there helping the women, supporting the women with agriculture, or has the man migrated and left the women to manage on their own? What kind of contributions? I think male contributions are very important. We often tend to ignore them, but I think what kind of contributions are they making? If they are migrant, then even if they want to contribute to childcare or cooking or something, they are physically not present, so they can't contribute. It may be a cash contribution. But in rural areas, we don't have creches, we don't have nurseries like in urban areas. So even if men send cash, who's going to look after these children? What are the arrangements for childcare? These all factors really play a role in terms of the experience of these linkages. Next, please. So I think one of the very important social protection programs to take account of seasonality, which was the first point that I mentioned, which the government of India introduced as part of the right to work, was the Mahatma Gandhi Nariga program. And of course, and we saw this was very, very helpful during the COVID-19 time. This picture is from then in Rajasthan. And men were coming back from Ahmedabad, from other places, because of COVID, because of lockdown. They were very traumatized by the time they could come back after having been, kept in very small enclosed places, not allowed to leave, and so on. And so men came back without any incomes. Women joined these the extra Nariga, which was really a saving grace. It was a line. But when we look at it from a nutrition perspective, very strenuous physical labor for 6 to 8 hours a day, and at the same time, they were doing it in order, because of their responsibility for getting some income for producing food security to the household, because the male cash incomes didn't come. But at the same time, I think it was a lot of hard work, and there was a real trade-off uh, in terms of household well-being and nutrition. We don't yet have the figures, unfortunately, for what has happened post-COVID time. But I think a lot of health and nutrition people feel that if we look at now the figures, post-COVID, post the last 2 years, that there will be a decline in terms of household health and nutrition. Next, please. So I will come to the issue of time and the intensification of women's labor, seasonality, and nutrition. So, as part of one of the projects, Lansa, which Ruchira had mentioned, we did very small scale, but using Government of India methodology on time use surveys. We did a very in-depth time use, but also diet survey with 60 households in two sites. Both were tribal. One was in Koraput in Odisha. The second was in Vidarbha in Wardha district in Maharashtra. And we repeated it with the same households over 3 seasons, agricultural seasons: planting, harvesting, and the lean season. And in fact, these results were a bit surprising. It's a very small sample, but it was a very in-depth study. That when we look at the total time use, as per Government of India formulation, when the first time use survey was done by Government of India in 1998, post Beijing, they came up with the figure that when they take account of all work or total work, that 53% was done by women. Actually, in this survey, it was a small survey, we found that this proportion has increased, that 56% of total work is being done by women. What was surprising to me, even to me, was that actually that agricultural work, I had assumed also, as many other people, that maybe women's contribution is 50 to 60% of total agricultural work. Actually, within these communities, we found that women were doing almost 75 to 80% of the work that men were doing. So almost 4/5 of what men were doing. And at the same time, they were doing almost 100%, 95% of all domestic and care work. And therefore, the time deficits for care work were much more intensive uh, during these peak seasons, but also particularly for women from landless and marginal households. And this is because these women were going as wage labor. And when you go as wage labor, you receive an income, but you have to work the full day. You cannot come back in between to look after your children and so on. And actually, we quantified it that almost if 4.5 hours of time is needed for collection of water, firewood, cooking, feeding, and so on, that almost 30% it declined during the planting and harvesting seasons. And the other thing we found in terms of women's own health, and this is contradictory to all research on seasonal weight losses. There have been a few research, mainly in Africa, which looked at seasonal weight gains and weight loss in terms of body weight. And actually, in Africa, they find that this is much more for men, because men's work is seen as more intensive during the peak seasons, and then during the lean season they have time for recovery. But actually in India, we in our sample it was opposite, that we found that women are encountering greater seasonal weight loss, and this is because of intense activity during these seasons, as I said, planting season, but reduced consumption, because there is both not enough food, but there is also not enough time for cooking this food. Next, please. And I'll just give you some examples from our data on Koraput, that this was using the time spent on SNA. SNA is the productive work or the system of national accounts. And when we looked at, different seasons, but also by different caste or ethnic group and gender. I think it's very interesting. If you look across these different groups, the first is the scheduled castes or the Harijans, that, during the planting season, it is almost equal, 9 hours for women and 10 hours for men. But during the other periods, women's work participation is coming down. This is partly because most of the scheduled caste men are migrating, and therefore women have to stay at home to look after the children and any other small work. Then the three are tribes. Bhumya, Gadba, Paraja are all tribes, but they are different kinds of tribes. The Parajas are the landless, the poorest amongst these tribes. The Bhumyas are the ones who with land holding. The Gadabas also have livestock, which was mentioned. So I think there is some difference across these three tribes. And when you see the poorest of them, the Parajas, you find that actually across the seasons, the amount of women work that women are doing, except for planting, men is slightly higher at 12 hours per day, and women at about 10 hours. But the amount of work between men and women is almost the same throughout this period. Amongst the OBCs, also we have two groups, the Malis and the Ranas. The Malis are cultivators; they are vegetable producers, and here also you find that because their livelihood depends on vegetable production and sale in the market, the women are very actively involved with this productive work almost throughout the year. Next, please. And when we look at the ESNA, or the Extended System of National Accounts, which is really taking account of the domestic work or the care work, you see very clearly again that there are seasonal fluctuations in the amount of time spent on domestic and care work. But for some of these groups, uh, you find that really, like for Parojas, there is not much change. Lean season, slightly time is more, but otherwise, in the planting season, for all the groups, for the women, the time spent on domestic and care work really comes down by almost 30%. And we did a further unpacking of what is included, because the time use data methodology allows us to do it. And we found that the cooking is the most time consuming of all domestic tasks. So if you have 4 hours, maybe 2 hours goes for cooking. And cooking and cleaning are exclusively female tasks. The blue lines show you the contributions of men. There is a little contribution from men, but they mainly contribute in terms of, looking after the children, holding the children while the women are doing work, or taking them out, maybe helping some of the older children with homework and so on, supervising the children. But in terms of cooking and cleaning is exclusively women's task. And this is where the time decline really hits cooking the worst. Next. The second area which I wanted to briefly talk about is women's shrinking control over the production systems, like the choices in terms of decisions around cropping patterns and so on. And this is happening due to multiple reasons, both physical, social, economic, and so on. One thing is climate change. In most rural areas, we know climate change is a reality. There is rainfall variability in terms of number of days and timing of the rainfall, and there's declining water table in the lowlands. And because of some of these factors as well, men have been migrating out, because they find that agriculture has become very unreliable. Even though if there's a good harvest, it is good, but otherwise it has become unreliable both in terms of climate and in terms of the markets or the pricing. So we see in many cases when there is a good harvest, actually also farmers suffer. We read it in the newspaper because the prices crash. A lot of produce comes into the mandis or into the markets. Onions we have seen, tomatoes we have seen, that farmers have to throw it away because they feel that the price has crashed and it is not even worth them spending transportation to take it to the market. All this has led to male migration. What male migration also does is that it is reducing the labor available for agriculture in the village. And we find in some of these tribal areas, this picture is from Koraput, that women are left, with smaller families, declining this thing. And in tribal areas, in many rural areas, actually, you find that children's help during holidays and so on. In tribal areas, unfortunately, there is not really a secondary school at the village level. They normally have these ashram vidyalayas and so on, which are residential schools for children, which are in the block headquarters or something like that. So after the age of 12 or 13, if children want to pursue education, they go away to the boarding schools. So their labor is not available at the home. If the man also goes away, the land ownership is both from lowland to upland. So they have over the slope land. They prioritize the lowland where they grow paddy or millets. And in the upland, actually, women used to grow millets, vegetables, dals, horse gram, kulit, pulses, and so on. Most of it for home use. It also provided dietary diversity. Now what has happened is, first of all, they don't have labor. Secondly, there has been a big push for contract farming, and in this area in central India, from the paper industry, that eucalyptus plantations have been widely promoted. We see it right from Odisha to Maharashtra, all along central Indian belt. You see eucalyptus plantations which have come up in these tribal areas, in the upland areas. Of course, eucalyptus has both physical as well as social and other effects, because it takes out the water, it further reduces the water table. This land cannot be used for other kinds of crops after the eucalyptus plantation. Second thing is that these contracts are made with the men, because man is the land owner. Earlier, as I said, this land was used by women. I mean, man may still be the landowner, but within a household, there was a lot of cooperation. So the upland was understood that women were growing millets, vegetables, etc., for home consumption and for some sale in the market, like little surplus tomato you take to the weekly heart or market, sell it, get little income, and so on. Now, with eucalyptus plantations, this is completely not possible. So you have a reduction in crop diversity at the same time that the income from eucalyptus comes once in 4 years. So over the 12-year period, thrice they pay, fourth year, eighth year, and 12th year. There is a bulk payment that comes, which is true that there is a bulk payment that comes. But we know in terms of household expenditures, when you get 100 rupees or 200 rupees, you spend it on the immediate food. When you get 1 lakh rupees, then you spend it on something different. You spend it on improving the house, purchasing cattle, any kind of fixed asset, machinery or equipment, or you spend it on education fees for the children, for boarding school, and so on. So, money that was earlier used to boost up the household nutrition through small production in these uplands is now converted into plantation forestry of eucalyptus, and that money, the purpose of whatever money comes from that, is used for a different purpose. It is no longer used for household consumption. The other thing that has happened is that also there has been lot of changes in terms of the forest regulations, in terms of access to forests, the laws and policies, that many of the common property resources and water bodies which people depended on have now been converted into reserved, and so on. And this leads to declining access to what we call as uncultivated foods or forest foods, which really contributed a lot to the nutrition of these households. There is an increasing dependence on the public distribution system under NFSA, and this has been a savior. But of course, we know that the public distribution system has mainly been focusing on cereals, not on dietary diversity. So there is no way. This discussion has now come up after COVID. Many state governments started giving some dal, oil, and so on, also through the public distribution system in order to create a more balanced diet. Next, please. And the third issue that I wanted to talk about here is also in terms of culture and social practices. And I think this was an issue, probably a question also raised by Dr. Kumar about awareness and value. And I think food is something which is very much linked to status. So what food you eat is seen as a status. So we always say, he had raised the issue of millets, that many of these communities used to eat millets, but at that time we used to see millets 30, 40 years ago as very low status food. Only poor people eat it. Upper class people don't eat it. As the awareness has grown, people like us have started eating millets. But those people who used to eat millets have now actually given up millets and gone to white polished rice, partly because of the factor that I just said, the changes in land use patterns and in cropping patterns and contract farming, changes in labor arrangements, but also due to it is availability from the PDS, but also seen as high status foods. Now, many of us would have heard that from the hills, Uttarakhand and so on, where there were a lot of, again, ragi, mandwa, bhatki dal, local dals, and so on. They have all moved to Maggi noodles. And the reason for Maggi noodles is that one is firewood, secondly time, that it's 2 minutes and you can cook it in 2 minutes, and it has some spices, masala, children like the flavor of it, but nutrition wise it is really into very low. But it is seen as, it is advertised, you get the advertisements in the TV and so on. So these are seen as high status foods, elite foods, urban foods. So rural people have also, as markets have penetrated, you find, I was in Uttarakhand last year in April in 2021, just before the second wave, and even in village shop you see crisps, chips, you see Maggi noodles, you see Coke and Pepsi, and these are the things that even children are wanting. I have seen this in my work in Africa as well, that children in very poor villages where I visited in Kenya, they were saying they were used to run behind us and say Coke, Coke, Coke. They wanted Coke. Now Coke is empty calories, it's not really a nutritious drink. The prices, and because of markets, I think these goods have become cheaper, whereas vegetables, fruits, meat are really not affordable. The other thing that has happened linked to status is also, to some extent, influence of religion. In many of these tribal areas, I think there has been a lot of campaigning for vegetarianism, and giving up. As I said, that in these scheduled tribe areas, because they had access to forests, people would often have, during the month of Chet, for instance, April, there would be a ritual, which was ritual hunt. Nowadays, not much animals in the forest, but some small things, some khargosh, some rabbits, some things. So they had some sources of protein from the field during the monsoon period, some small fish, prawn, snails, and so on. Now that they are being told, especially these upwardly mobile amongst the tribals for status reasons, like the Bhumiyas I mentioned, who are landowning, they have really come under the influence of this and said that we should become vegetarian. That gives us better status, higher status. It can help us move up in the social ranking. And this has also affected their diets, because our culture and our religion is very closely linked to what we eat and our food. The other thing that has happened is a lot of propagation of fasting. So I found, whether it was in Maharashtra, whether it was in Odisha, people are, men also, not only women, men also are fasting 1 day a week, 2 days a week. These are already undernourished people, they're already working very hard in the fields, and on top of that, if they are fasting so much, I think this also affects their nutritional status. So I think there is a real tension and a trade off between some of our status giving practices in India, for women particularly, who are sort of seen as the, if you like, repository of status. And spoke to some of these people, in these areas, and they said, nay, sometimes if men have hard work, they need not fast, but women must fast. So this rule or the social norm is much more stronger for women. Okay, next, please. And this also affects, through the life course. I think this is also something to be noted, that malnutrition is widespread across all age groups. But I think the school feeding in terms of our practical interventions has really helped to some extent, because in the of 6 to 17 age group, at least for some groups like the scheduled tribe, scheduled uh, 12 to 17 scheduled caste also. I think your scheduled caste, really scheduled tribe do worst. But despite the fact that we have tried to remove all caste discrimination in terms of school feeding programs and so on, clearly some of it remains and is visible in some of this data. But I think still it has had an impact in terms of reducing, particularly for the adolescent age group. And this is once again an area where we might have some difference because of COVID. Okay, I will just quickly go through actually a few other points and then stop. So next, please. And of course, the pervasiveness of violence, I have said already. I think the one point only from this I wanted to pick up is that exclusion from farmer cooperatives, FPOs, and so on. I think what are the institutional mechanisms? We did a study of FPOs, and now FPOs are being promoted by the government as there will be 10,000 new FPOs and so on. We found that only about 3% of FPOs are women led. Some women are members of FPOs, but they really have no decision making power within these. They also have no support. I just wanted to mention the case of Almora, actually, in Uttarakhand, which I visited, that because of the high level of male migration, the government, through the Ministry of Rural Development and Panchayati Raj, through the Integrated Livelihood Support Program supported by IFAD, they have actually focused on forming women's FPOs and federations of self-help groups. And the reason these have been working well is that because men are not there, women have been given all the support, they have been encouraged to grow their own produce. But very important is marketing. Here they had a tie-up in Almora with the Ministry of Women and Child Development, where for Anganwadi centers, they are purchasing this nutritious meal from the Women's Federation or the Women's FPO, and which is including many of these traditional goods, the bhatki dal, the mandua, ragi, and so on. This is a very innovative model. And actually, here also there is a lot of pressure. Like last year in 2021, there was pressure on Ministry of Women and Child Development to put open tender for purchase of inputs for nutritious meal for the Anganwadi centers. And actually, all these women's federations supported by civil society, they really protested. They said that if you don't purchase from us, then we will not be able to compete in the markets. There will be a negative, because once contractors and private players come in, they will purchase from the women's federation, but at a much lower rate. So even though there is some problem that government payments take some time and so on, these FPOs of women have been able to survive because of marketing support. Now, as the government is pulling back on the marketing support, many of these FPOs have also started admitting men as members. And I was a bit upset, but also saw this is the reality, because women are not so mobile. These are hilly areas, distances are long, they have to come home at night, that it is the men then who go to explore other markets. So now almost 10% of these women FPOs, 10% of members now they have included as men in order to help with the marketing. So I think when we think about, women farmers, giving them rights, improving nutrition, which they were trying to do, I think public policy is very important. That how do we look at public policy that can enable these women's empowerment and also nutrition at the same time without disadvantaging them. Okay, so I will just quickly go through, because I think we have more or less finished the time that I had for my talk. So if you can just, I will skip the next two slides just very quickly in terms of the impact of COVID-19 and what it has done. Actually, maybe later on you can share, there is a link to a little film on the previous slide, which I had made last year in July with fishing communities in Tamil Nadu, where actually they were talking about indebtedness due to COVID, how all rural women I have found, and this was fishing women, just a 1-minute film, where they actually say that, there was no money, there was no transport, we could not go out to sell fish. They sold all their assets, whatever jewelry they had, and they are all deeply indebted in order to produce food for the family. Next, please. So I think in terms of just coming to the last part, which is on how do we conceptualize in terms of the policy link from the evidence that we have. This is from the high-level panel of experts report to the Commission on Food Security, report 15. Where we basically thought that there are 4 pillars. One is the right to food, which India has done well on. Secondly, we widen the understandings of the different dimensions of food security and adopt a systems approach, which is very important, and think about how does this understanding lead to certain critical policy shifts. So next, please. India has done, as I said, we can move on to the next, has done well in terms of the National Food Security Act. And these were the 4 dimensions. This is a definition from FAO that food security is a situation that exists when all people at all times have physical, social, and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food that meets their dietary needs and food preferences for an active and healthy life. It was thought of in 4 dimensions. The availability of food, that was by the focus on production, the access to food, a public distribution system, getting food to people, and so on, purchasing power, utilization. This include the enabling environment in terms of water, healthcare, and the short-term stability. And we have added 2 more, that with the context of climate change, we have to look at long-term sustainability as well, not only short-term stability. So it needs to be, resilient to climate, the kind of food that is produced. And finally, that people's agency, in terms of what they want to eat, what are their traditional practices, rather than imposing the status, let people also have some choice about what food to grow, how to consume it, what to consume, and so on. And how do we facilitate this process? Next, please. In terms of a systems thinking, I think systems thinking can be at 2 levels. One is at the individual household level. And this is a diagram taken from the World Food Programme report on India, that if we look at the livelihoods, I think I would really want to bring attention to the 3 yellow rectangles, that what contributes to food security is not only the access to food, but it is also the care, that how is this food converted? When we talk about care, we talk about cooking, we talk about feeding. How is this household food converted into actually something which is individual food intake, which leads to food that can be consumed? Because you may have the raw materials. In Nepal, there was a famous study that there was food available in the house, but because there was no firewood to cook it, people were hungry. They could not eat. So I think one is food access, second is the care practices that help to convert this food, and finally the enabling environment. If you have food you consume, but if the water quality is poor and you're constantly having diarrhea or you're constantly having worms, then this is not going to improve your nutrition status. So you may eat a lot of food, but you may not be able to utilize it or absorb it. Next, please. And I think this is something that I have already said, that this is where we felt that if we take these 3 boxes together in terms of individual food intake, access, plus the care practices, then women's work comes at the center of understanding the linkages between agriculture, food production, and consumption or nutrition. And of course, this is mediated by the household socio-economic status. What is the caste? What is the position? What is the class? And so on. To some extent, it can be mediated by our social protection programs. So where we have like the public distribution system or Anganwadi workers or midday meal scheme, these can to some extent, override the negative impacts of poverty or household status. But this also then has an interaction, this food security, food consumption, and women's work in terms of women's own health. So I may be eating food, but if I'm doing much harder work compared to what I'm eating, then it can affect my health negatively, but it also affects the time available for care. And through that, indirectly, it also affects child nutrition. Next, please. The non-food factors like water, sanitation are very important. And I think the government of India now has been paying a lot of attention to drinking water supply, to toilets, and so on. But there is some there are some problems, of course, outstanding, that the toilets have been constructed under Swachh Bharat Abhiyan, but there is often no water supply. And I have seen in many areas that there are small tanks built next to the toilet, but the women actually have to collect water from the well to fill up that tank, which can be used for the toilet. So it's once again adding to the work burdens. These are not cleaned, maintained, and so on. And also, while India, we have no discrimination by caste, so to access to water like this, all castes can come, but within the village or within these communities, because of social hierarchies and rankings, they have some kind of norms, that the upper caste can take water first and then the lower caste can come afterwards. As I already said, that some of these scheduled caste other women are the ones who are working as wage laborers, so they go away early in the morning to work. They have no time to wait for collecting water at the end, and therefore they end up using unsafe, they continue to use unsafe forms of water, which further affects their nutritional status. Next, please. And at the systems level, I think this is where we get some insight into policy, that we need to recognize that there are multiple drivers to food systems, but also the middle layer is really that a food system is something right from production to the value chain, to storage, to packaging, marketing, advertising, and to consumer behaviors and the choices that people make. So there are many points which get affected by different things, by demography, by sociocultural factors, by political factors, by economic and price factors. So there are too many linkages within the food system at too many levels, right from production to the consumption or to the dietary choice, that actually affects the nutrition. So therefore, when we are thinking about policy intervention, how do we break this? We can think of interventions at different levels. Next, please. We can skip this and I will move to the last few slides on the recommendations. Yeah. So what the report recommended is that we need to really look in terms of critical policy shifts. We need to look at food security and nutrition not only as a health and nutrition or agriculture issue, but actually as a system interconnected with other systems. I think the DG correctly pointed out in the starting that pricing, economic incentives, demographic patterns, educational policies, all these are very important interconnected sectors. Secondly, we have focused on reducing hunger and undernutrition through our public distribution system, but we also need to think about all forms of malnutrition. The figure I showed you in the beginning for India is shameful in terms of anemia, highest in South Asia, bottom 5 in the world out of 156 countries. So we really need to think about dietary diversity. It is not enough for rice or wheat or some cereal to fill our stomachs. This was important to remove hunger and to get energy. But energy is not enough. We need to address protein deficiencies. We need to address vegetables, fruits, micronutrients as well. Third is we need to think about the whole food system, not only agricultural supply, but also about purchasing power, health expenditures, other kinds of aspects of the food system that needs change or transformation. And I think in order to do this, we were often going with global solutions. And I think now increasingly we realize that given the diversity, and particularly in a country like India, we need much more context specific and diverse solutions, solutions that are suitable to a particular context. Next, please. Next, please. So there are three kind of things that I want to finish with in terms of what we need to do. One is, and I think NIRD PR is in a good position actually in this domain to actually think about some of these issues and perhaps make policy recommendations or within their training programs and so on. One is the recognition of women as farmers and agricultural workers. I think the National Policy for Farmers 2007, which came out of the National Commission for Farmers, it recommended that any person in a rural area, man or woman, who is engaged in any kind of agricultural activity with a very broad definition, whether it is collection, poultry, forest produce collection, livestock, farming, should be considered as agricultural workers or farmers. And it should be the panchayat that actually gives some kind of identity card so that these women, and this should be acceptable to banks and other institutions. So this has not happened. That you need the identity, the recognition as agricultural workers. We keep talking about land rights. land rights cannot happen very easily because it is much more complicated process. It is linked to inheritance, it is linked to Hindu Succession Act, and so on. Many men may be unwilling to hand over land rights to women, but this is a simple way recommended by the National Policy of Farmers to give women identity as farmers, as workers by the panchayat. Panchayat knows what woman is doing what work. So any woman who is working in agriculture related activity should be recognized. And this might help to remove inequalities in access to assets, and perhaps in terms of wages. Wages is a much more complicated process in terms of, because it is also driven by external market related factors, but it is possible. And the Mahatma Gandhi Nariga, I think one good thing that has happened by Mahatma Gandhi Nariga is that it has at least equalized, created minimum wages for men and women for these activities, even though now we find that it is mostly women who are working in Mahatma Gandhi Nariga, because men don't want to work at the same wage. They want a higher wage than that. And I think panchayats really need to be strengthened. What my observation is that compared to what Panchayati Raj was 1990s, 2000s when it was set up, it was doing very well. Today, the panchayats are much more weakened. We found that in a lot of area with COVID, for instance, panchayats were not in a position. Some panchayats, yes, in some states, that is a lot of difference, a lot of diversity. But in many cases, panchayats were not empowered to take decisions, for instance, for storage of grains. Panchayats should be empowered to actually, for food security and nutrition, for seeds, for grains, for value addition, for storage, for instance, drying of vegetables. Traditionally, our grandmothers and so on, one way of maintaining dietary diversity was sun drying during the season, achar, and keeping it for other seasons when those vegetables or fruits were not available. Pickles. Now, nobody has time to do all of that. Can the panchayat really organize and think about dietary diversity and improve nutrition at the panchayat level? And also ensure women's representation, of course, at the decision-making bodies. Next, please. Secondly, agricultural policies and programs need to be gender sensitive. So one thing which we find in all the discussions on, cost of cultivation, C2 plus 50, minimum support price, I find that, women's labor is not calculated in calculating any of these costs. As I said, women are mainly unpaid labor, and this really, if we take the true cost of women's labor in the calculations, then all these prices will actually go up. It will also give recognition to women as workers, set a price or a cost for their family unpaid work. I think agricultural extension workers to also engage not just with the mainstream crops, but also with the crops, livestock, very importantly, which are controlled by women. We find at the present that there is very little extension advice available for millets, very little extension advice available for dals or pulses, very little extension advice available for vegetables or horticultural crops. It is mainly for rice, wheat, seeds are given, the blocks are organized, agricultural extension for the main crops, but not for any of these other crops which are controlled by women. I think drudgery reduction is, we cannot emphasize it enough, especially in post-harvest processing and storage. Unfortunately or fortunately, under the Ministry of Agriculture, the Indian Council of Agricultural Research, ICAR, one of the institutions based in Bhubaneswar, this was set up in the 1980s itself, when this issue was recognized in the sixth plan, that 1980 to 85 sixth plan actually recognized for the first time women's role in agriculture and rural development. And at that time, they set up the SIVA, the Center for Women in Agriculture in Bhubaneswar. This is one of the ICR institutions. They have been doing work on drudgery reduction. Unfortunately, it has remained confined to SIVA. The SIVA has not been able to mainstream some of these technologies, research approaches within other institutions of agricultural research and extension, agricultural universities, and so on. Okay, next, please. And I'll conclude with that, that the social protection And public investment also we need to think about. I think this was a point mentioned, that how do we reduce women's time burden and expand choices. So I think one thing is like PDS, which I already mentioned, and during COVID this has become very obvious that apart from rice and wheat, we need to expand the food basket. There is an option to do this within the National Food Security Act. So Karnataka gives ragi, now Odisha is also included some forms of ragi and millets within the public distribution system. I think this governments, to give credit, some of the schemes like Ujjwala for cooking gas, drinking water scheme, I think these are very good in terms of innovations to reduce the drudgery and also the time expenditure. And we need to have it in a much more joined up way. I think some of the problems that are coming up with Ujjwala is that, one cylinder is given for free, but after that, women are, because of the shrinking in purchasing power and the consumption choices, not really able to purchase other cylinders and so on. So I think we need to give some thought to improve this. The other last point and very important point is, when we talk about care work, I had mentioned earlier that in urban areas for middle classes, we have childcare services, Montessori's, nursery schools. We can hire domestic workers, ayas, and so on. But in the rural area, the 0 to 2 is a very critical period. And we have a very good program in India, the Integrated Child Development Services, ICDS, which has Anganwadis across the country. But Anganwadis have become source mainly of giving the nutrition and immunization. One of the purposes of Anganwadis was also child care. This has not really happened. And I think we really need to strengthen the Anganwadi system to provide adequate and quality child care and feeding of the child during the daytime so that the mother can go to work without any concern about the feeding of the child, particularly in peak planting seasons. There are some new studies which have come up, in Odisha, in certain areas, there has been experiment uh, with setting up these whole day childcare creches in rural areas in very small blocks in Odisha. And this is having very good results in terms of child nutrition. So I think we know that we have solutions, but how can we really invest? If we take a gender lens, if we identify some of these problems, how can we really address in terms of strengthening it? So I think my last concluding slide, and then I will stop and open it up. So I think it is really about the need to disaggregate, the need not to look at groups as homogeneous, whether it is men, whether it is women. And also for policy, I think that to recognize that just engagement in agriculture alone doesn't automatically lead to improved consumption. I think agriculture is more feminized than we recognize in the national data because of women's contribution to the total economy is significant, and it entails seasonal time and energy squeezes. And this kind of data, like the time use data, really needs to inform the agriculture and social protection interventions and policies. Thanks very much.